August 15th, 1945. The world paused. Across Japan, radios crackled to life as Emperor Hirohito's voice, calm, almost hesitant, echoed through homes for the first time in history. "Endure the unendurable," he said, announcing surrender. For millions of Japanese, it was a moment of disbelief. Years of fighting, sacrifice, and devastation had led here. A nation humbled, broken, and without choice. Thousands of miles away, in the scattered archipelago of the Pacific, another kind of silence took hold. Not the silence of surrender, but the quiet of an unspoken human question. What now? For some, the answer was not to return home. Instead, they chose something utterly unexpected. They chose the enemy. In the weeks and months after Japan's surrender, stories began to surface. Stories that would sound improbable, even absurd, to those living in peacetime. Japanese women, former prisoners of war, nurses, or civilians caught in the chaos of occupation, began asking American soldiers to marry them, not for love alone, but for survival, for safety, for a chance at a life in a country that had once been their enemy. It was not part of anyone's plan. The war manual contained no section on wartime romance, let alone on proposals from the conquered to their conquerors. Yet these unions began to appear, small sparks of intimacy flickering amid the ash of total war. The expectations on both sides could not have been more opposed. Japanese civilians, especially women, had been told for years that Americans were barbarians, enemy invaders who brought destruction, humiliation, and shame. American soldiers, trained to see the Japanese as the enemy, carried scars, physical and mental, of years of brutal island fighting. There should have been nothing but distrust. Yet the reality was different. On Guam, in makeshift camps still littered with the wreckage of war, Japanese women began to speak to soldiers. Some asked for cigarettes or chocolate, curious about the strange kindness in a world of violence. Others asked for English lessons. A few, in hushed voices, asked if they could marry. For them, marriage was not just about companionship. It was a pathway out of camps, out of uncertainty, and into a future far from the ruins of a homeland they might never see again. It began as whispers. In a crowded mess hall where American GIs sipped coffee, one soldier recalled overhearing a woman speak softly in broken English. "If I marry you, I can stay here." The words lingered in the air. They were as improbable as they were poignant. For some, it was pragmatism. For others, it was desperation. For a few, perhaps, it was something resembling love. The numbers are startling. By 1952, over 45,000 Japanese women had entered the United States as war brides. Most came after the war, through official channels under the War Brides Act. But there were earlier, smaller waves, proposals made in the shadow of surrender, in the makeshift camps of the Pacific, in the twilight months of occupation. These were not merely individual choices. They were quiet revolutions, reshaping the lives of soldiers and civilians alike. The reality of life in those camps was a strange mixture of discipline and humanity. Soldiers on guard duty wore the scars of battle, shattered boots, torn uniforms, faces hardened by loss. But in the mess halls, laughter could still be heard. A chocolate bar was a treasure, a rare sweetness in ration life. A cigarette passed across a fence could bridge the gap between two worlds. These small gestures mattered. They reshaped the way people saw each other. One Japanese nurse remembered her first encounter with an American soldier. "I thought they would kill us." Instead, one soldier handed me chewing gum. I had never tasted it before. To her, it was not simply a snack. It was a moment of unexpected humanity. To soldiers, those moments became awkward, sometimes humorous exchanges. "Guess I never thought I'd be asked to marry someone while wearing the same boots I fought in yesterday." One GI wrote home. The relationships grew slowly. Some began with language lessons under the shade of coconut trees. Others were born of necessity, companionship in the face of uncertainty. Yet the idea of marriage, especially to a former enemy, was explosive. The Japanese women who proposed faced accusations of betrayal from their own countrymen. In America, the idea challenged laws and prejudices. Until 1947, many states technically barred interracial marriages with Japanese nationals. It was not just love or survival at stake. It was legality. Still, proposals happened, and they happened in ways that surprised both sides. In makeshift barracks and camp kitchens, amid the scent of coffee and gun oil, a few brave women stepped forward. Sometimes the request came with a laugh, sometimes with tears. "If I marry you, I can stay here," one whispered to a soldier. Others said, "Better to be with you than face the uncertainty of Japan." For soldiers, some of whom had seen the worst of war, the choice was bewildering. To marry the woman who was once their enemy? It was something the Army had never prepared them for. These relationships forced transformations in perception. For Japanese women, the war had been a story of loss of home, family, dignity. For some, an American soldier became not the face of defeat, but of rescue. For American soldiers, the enemy became human, not just faces in the photographs of intelligence reports, but women with names, fears, laughter, and dreams. Historians still debate the reasons behind these proposals. Some see them as pragmatic arrangements, survival strategies born of desperation. Others argue they were genuine acts of affection, rare blossoms of humanity in the shadow of war. What remains indisputable is that they challenged the narratives of the war. They blurred the lines between enemy and ally, conqueror and captive, survival and love. The U.S. government did not fully understand what was happening. Bureaucrats debated whether such marriages should be allowed, whether they violated laws or military regulations. For ordinary soldiers, it was simpler. They answered proposals with surprise, confusion, and sometimes agreement. In letters home, they confessed bewilderment. "Never thought I'd be fighting the war of love," one wrote. Another joked. The U.S. Army Handbook never included a section called How to Propose to a Former Enemy Combatant. Yet behind the humor lay something deeper, a quiet shift in the meaning of victory. War is remembered for battles and treaties. But here was a different kind of resolution, a surrender not sealed with paper, but with a vow, a choice made in the uncertainty of post-war life. To marry the enemy was to rewrite the ending of a war story. It was to step into an uncertain future together, even while the world still struggled to understand how and why it happened. By the time the first Japanese war bride set foot on American soil, the phenomenon had already begun to alter lives in ways no general could have foreseen. It was not just a matter of romance. It was survival. It was a human need to find belonging. For some women, marriage to an American soldier was a ticket to safety, a chance to leave behind the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the shame of defeat, the pain of starvation. For soldiers, it was a humanizing experience, proof that enemies were not fixed identities, but people shaped by circumstance, grief, and sometimes unexpected connection. In the aftermath of war, choices like these carried meaning far beyond the individuals involved. They challenged nations to reconsider what victory and defeat really meant. They blurred the clear lines of wartime morality. They revealed that even in the darkest moments, human beings could still reach across that divide. And yet, it was only the beginning. These marriages bore in the strange twilight of war, would soon face another battleground. The courts, the streets, the hearts of families who could not accept them. But that story belongs to what comes next. For now, there remains the image of that moment. An American soldier sitting on the edge of a cot, chewing gum he had smuggled from a mess hall, staring at a Japanese nurse who had just asked him a question no one had expected. "Will you marry me?" she asked. And in the silence that followed, history was quietly, irreversibly changed. The first Japanese war bride stepped onto American soil in the late 1940s, like ghosts from another world, carrying nothing but a suitcase, a hope, and a name given to them by circumstance rather than choice. They came ashore in Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, met by husbands, strangers, and the curious eyes of strangers in equal measure. Their arrival was a quiet scandal, an oddity no one in Washington had fully anticipated. To many Americans, the idea of a Japanese wife was still unthinkable. Less than a decade earlier, the nation had been at war with Japan, fighting battles so brutal they became legend. Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, millions of lives lost, cities burned, families torn apart. To marry someone from the enemy nation seemed impossible. And yet, the post-war world had a way of rewriting what was considered impossible. Families of soldiers reacted in ways that ranged from bewilderment to outrage. In small towns across the Midwest, word spread quickly. A soldier returning with a Japanese bride was a story told and retold. "You married who?" a soldier's mother once said. "From Japan?" It was said with mixture of disbelief and worry. Fear of the unknown, of cultural difference, and of judgment weighed heavily. In Japan, the reaction was no less complicated. Women who chose to marry Americans were often branded as traitors. To family and friends, their choice seemed a betrayal of nation, a rejection of shared suffering. Letters exchanged between families tell of shame and accusation, of sisters refusing to speak to their brides who had crossed the sea, of fathers saying they had abandoned Japan. For these women, marriage was not simply personal. It was political. The obstacles were not only emotional, but legal, until the War Brides Act of 1947 was amended. Immigration laws in the United States heavily restricted entry for Asian spouses. Many states had laws prohibiting interracial marriages. Bureaucrats debated endlessly. Diplomats exchanged memoranda, and in courtrooms across America, the fate of these marriages was contested. For the women involved, each day in limbo was a test of endurance. For soldiers, it was a fight not on battlefields, but in offices and at immigration desks. The stories that emerge from these struggles are vivid, often touching, and sometimes tinged with bitterness. A young Japanese bride arriving in San Francisco in 1946 recalled stepping down from the ship and seeing a sea of unfamiliar faces. "They stared at me as though I was a ghost," she told an interviewer years later. "I carried nothing but hope in a suitcase." Her husband, a former soldier, said in a letter to his parents, "They don't understand why I married her, but I do." In other cases, acceptance came slowly, painfully. One soldier told how his parents refused to acknowledge his wife for years. They wouldn't sit at the same table, he said, until she cooked them rice with chopsticks. Then something changed. Maybe they saw she was willing to learn, to become part of the family. These small acts of cultural bridging, cooking, language learning, raising children, were the quiet battlegrounds of post-war life. By the early 1950s, tens of thousands of Japanese women had made that crossing. The steamship docks of America became stages for moments of vulnerability and courage. Women carrying small bundles, children clinging to their skirts, stepping onto foreign soil with eyes wide open. The contrast was striking. The ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on one side, the bright promise of California kitchens on the other. These arrivals were not just migrations. They were transformations. Statistics tell part of the story. More than 80% of Japanese war brides married men from working class or military backgrounds. Many were young, barely out of their teens. Most arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs, facing language barriers, prejudice, and cultural dissonance. Yet they built lives. They raised families. They became teachers, nurses, homemakers, and in doing so, they shaped a generation. The human testimonies preserved in archives capture these transformations in detail. One Japanese bride remembered her first dinner with her husband's family. "When I first cooked miso soup," she said, "his mother thought it was medicine, but she ate it anyway." There was humility in that act, and perhaps the beginning of acceptance. An American GI later reflected, "She was the enemy, but she loved my son. What could I do?" The humor of these moments was often dry, tinged with irony. Soldiers joked that they had fought for liberty overseas only to bring home a Japanese wife who insisted they bow before meals. Others laughed at the cultural misunderstandings. Washers called washing machine in Japan, soy sauce poured like water. These moments, small and human, broke down the larger tensions of history. For the women themselves, the transformation was profound. Many had survived unimaginable hardship, captivity, displacement, loss. Marriage was, in some ways, a continuation of survival, but it was also a choice. Some wrote later that it was love. Others admitted it was safety. Many said it was both. In the quiet of their new homes, far from battlefields and barbed wire, these women built a new identity, part Japanese, part American, part a story that neither nation could have predicted. The larger cultural impact was significant. The The War Brides Act changed immigration policy, creating new pathways for Asian immigration to the United States for the first time since exclusion laws were passed in the early 20th century. These marriages became a symbol of reconciliation, of transformation, of the complexities of war. They showed that identity was not fixed and that the line between enemy and ally could be crossed. Yet the road was not without hardship. Many Japanese war brides faced prejudice. They were often isolated, dependent on their husbands for survival, and under pressure to assimilate. Churches offered community, but not always acceptance. Schools became battlegrounds for children who were neither fully Japanese nor fully American. The stories of these women are stories of resilience, of navigating hostility and forging belonging in a world that had once been defined by conflict. In the decades that followed, the lives of these couples became woven into the fabric of American society. The children of war brides grew up speaking two languages, carrying two cultures. Their parents told stories of barbed wire and chocolate bars, of camps and laughter, of survival and love. These stories became a living testament to a strange and unexpected chapter of history, one in which marriage became a quiet rebellion, a bridge, and a new beginning. There's a symbolic image that lingers above all others. A Japanese bride, standing at Ellis Island in the early morning light, clutching a small child, her face a mixture of apprehension and hope. Behind her lies a homeland reduced to ashes. Ahead lies an uncertain future. She whispers in two tongues, one for the child, one for herself, Japanese and English, words of comfort, words of promise. These women, once prisoners of war, became pioneers of a different kind. They crossed oceans, cultures, and prejudices. They married the enemy, not always for love, but always for survival and the hope of something more. In doing so, they became part of a story of reconciliation, of a world learning that enemies are not eternal, and that peace sometimes begins in the quiet choice of a single heart. History remembers battles, treaties, and treaties broken. But sometimes the greater victories are found in the personal, in the choices people make when the guns fall silent. In a way, the story of the Japanese war brides is not just about war. It is about what comes after, about courage, adaptation, forgiveness, and the strange, fragile miracle of human connection. In the quiet aftermath of the war, when flags were lowered and cities rebuilt, they stood as living proof that history does not always end with the signing of peace. Sometimes it continues quietly in kitchens and classrooms, in whispered promises, in marriages that crossed oceans and bridged worlds. And that is how, in the strange twilight of war, the enemy became family.